Hello, Endeavor here. There's a phenomenon that I and I'm sure many others have experienced in the modern world, especially those who embrace alternative worldviews. It's the inability to make sense of it all. We live in a time of confusion and contradiction, clown world as it's become known. You can get the feeling that there's something deeply wrong with modernity, but not having a grounding to answer these questions can leave you angry and lost. In a different era, there would have been a healthy societal framework capable of answering these questions, but in our time, that framework has rotted away. Our societal framework today is incapable and unwilling to solve the problem. So we're left with a group of disaffected souls trying to figure this out. It can drive you mad looking for answers. I sure know it has for me. So I want to give whatever insight I can into what helped me understand the world better. What were some things that shaped my worldview into what it is today? For anyone exploring dissident right-wing politics trying to make sense of it all, or for anyone on the left who sees my views as detestable, this is my political journey. This is how I became a reactionary. To give some background on myself, I was born in Canada in 1995. I'm ethnically Scottish, but my family moved to Canada back in the 19th century. I grew up in North York, a region of Toronto. I'm from a middle-class family and, by all accounts, I had a good upbringing. So how exactly did I form the worldview that I hold today? Well, when you hear people explain how they were red-pilled, they usually start off as a libertarian or even as a leftist and eventually made their way over to the right, or they had some experience with multiculturalism or progressive politics and it pushed them that way. For me, it was somewhat different. Toronto is one of the most diverse and one of the most progressive cities in all of the Western world. But for me, this actually was not what sent me on my path. In my teenage years, I felt like somewhat of an outcast, which is nothing unusual for boys that age. I generally spent my time with video games, sports, and other common pastimes of teenage boys. The first thing that struck me as wrong with the world that I grew up in was the sense of nihilism and emptiness to it all, despite being from a relatively well-off family. When I was young, there was an elderly man who lived in my neighborhood. He had been a veteran of the Polish resistance in World War II. He often told war stories, which were the start of my interest in history. It became my favorite subject in middle school and continued to be so in high school. It was these stories that I read about World War II, or the Canadian settlers, or the Renaissance that made me feel that the modern world really lacked a purpose that existed in previous eras. When I was 17, I watched the American Civil War films Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, which to this day are two of my favorite films ever. They were what inspired me to read history outside of school and to learn about different historical eras. My favorite became Victorian-era Canada, and I eventually took up an interest in old 19th century historical sites which I came across in Toronto or other parts of Canada. I became fascinated with history, but it also gave me a sense that there was something missing in the world I lived in. I read about past eras that seemed to have a purpose that I was longing for. I saw an episode of the show Pawn Stars where a customer brought in an antique cash register. I remember that Rick commented that it was made at a time when people cared about the things they made looking good. This got me to compare the aesthetics of the things in the world around me to that of historical eras. From the clothes, to the art, to the architecture, to something as simple as a cash register, everything in the modern world just looked so ugly in comparison. This is where my dissatisfaction with modernity began, but at this point, I really didn't understand that there was something deeply wrong with my era. I just thought it was boring, and that's it. In my last year of high school, I took a Political Science 101 course. It was the beginning of 2013 and I had just turned 18 years old. This is where I first began to take up political positions, albeit ones firmly within the Overton window. Being someone already dissatisfied with liberal society, I looked for the political position that would best answer the questions I had. But the closest thing to that which I was actually exposed to at the time was just normie conservatism. Though I wasn't able to articulate it yet, I was someone who appreciated hierarchy and order. I saw things like feminism, the LGBT movement, or multiculturalism as contrary to that. Plus, my political science teacher was a male feminist, which instantly turned me against the left. However, my position at this point wasn't any different than your average conservative politician. But even at this point, I saw flaws with the positions that I had adopted. For example, this was before I understood the concept of Whig history or the reactionary position on it, but I already kind of saw that this was true. I observed that society did seem to be constantly shifting leftward. I also got the feeling that the left was in full control of the culture and the discourse, despite there being a supposedly conservative government in office at the time. I also understood that normie conservatism didn't really have any real critique of liberalism that I had been craving. But since it was all I had at my disposal, I drew conclusions that it was socialism and big government that were the problem. Admittedly, I did search for alternative right-wing ideologies early on. I became interested in the figure of Benito Mussolini and fascism and searched for an alternative, but since it was a stigmatized ideology, I obviously never adopted it. Now, the high school I attended in Toronto was very ethnically diverse. I was already in the minority by the time I got to high school, but believe it or not, this actually wasn't that big of a factor for me while I was developing my political views. Now, to be fair, it was majority East Asian, so it's not like the situations in some of the inner city schools in America. And looking back, it might have played a bigger subconscious role than I realized, but at the time, I really didn't think that much of it. Of course, I was exposed to the multicultural propaganda in high school, though it was not nearly as extreme as it is today. I was mildly ethnocentric at the time, and the idea of multiculturalism kind of seemed off to me, but I didn't really do that much to question it. Had you asked me at the time I graduated high school, I would have said ethnicity just didn't matter at all. But only a month later, the first cracks in this worldview appeared to me. In July 2013, the media was set ablaze by the George Zimmerman trial. Though I hadn't been following the trial, when the verdict was announced that Zimmerman was acquitted in the death of Trayvon Martin, the reaction I observed on social media was shocking for me. I had no opinion on the trial one way or the other, but what shocked me was how the media racialized the case and spun it as if it was this evil act committed by white America, despite the fact that Zimmerman himself was clearly not a white man, he was Hispanic. It seems hard to believe how recent this was and that I'm from one of the most progressive cities in the world, but this was the first time I ever heard the phrase white privilege used. And even more shocking was the rhetoric being posted on Facebook by my former classmates, many of whom I considered to be my friends. So this was my first brush with militant leftist politics. This would become more common the following September when I started university. I attended university in downtown Toronto, a cosmopolitan city known for multiculturalism and progressive politics. It was quite a change from where I lived in North York. The problem of social isolation and nihilism seemed much more pronounced. I studied business management at university, but even then I didn't escape the intersectionality and cultural Marxism being shoved down my throat. Though I avoided the courses that were just obviously leftist indoctrination, it still made its way into the regular curriculum, especially through things like HR. Now I started to hear about things like white privilege, feminism, colonialism, and LGBT more often. I never fell for it. I rejected it immediately. And then 2014 and the whole Gamergate fiasco came around, and these same politics were now inserted into video games and other entertainment. Another thing I lamented was the lack of any group capable of giving me a feeling of male brotherhood. In high school, I played sports which provided me a sense of fraternity, but once I got to university, that was something I was really missing. Everything needed to be gender neutral, which led to it being feminized. There was really no outlets for a healthy expression of masculinity, which left me feeling unaccomplished and atomized. At this point, I was looking for any alternative to the worldview being forced upon me. The political content I began to consume was what would be called boomer conservatism today. I started watching things like PragerU, Steven Crowder, Bill Whittle, and PJ Media. This reinforced my belief that socialism was the problem, and the biggest threat from leftist politics was communism coming about. I consumed the whole socialism killed 100 million people meme, and that the West was great because of capitalism and democracy. Basically, at this point, I had the beliefs of your average campus conservative, though deep down, I still knew that this worldview didn't really provide a real critique of liberalism, since, looking back, now I knew I held the same base assumptions of liberalism. It was around 2014 when I first encountered neo-reaction and other alternative right-wing beliefs online. Though I secretly found them appealing, I was still under the influence of the egalitarian conditioning I'd undergone in public education, and I wasn't brave enough to seriously consider them yet. I had the dilemma I'm sure a lot of people face when they encounter far-right beliefs. I thought, well, a lot of this seems true, but believing this might be racist, and I don't want to be a hateful bigot after all. So I remained a normie conservative, though at this point I was well aware that the left had complete control over the culture, and the right as it existed in mainstream politics had absolutely no response to it. It was entirely focused on economics, and as someone who originally became interested in politics out of a desire for conservative culture, I saw the dead end of the right side of the liberal paradigm for what it really was. So from around mid-2014 to mid-2015, I began to lose interest in politics. This was just as the polarization we're seeing today was beginning, so it was still something you could escape. Over this year, most of my attention was put toward things like video games, NFL, and reading history. I felt a void in modern society, but I had really no way of answering it. But the political issue was still something you could avoid at that point. I had been an atheist until I was 19, but in late 2014 I converted to Christianity, seeking an alternative to the mainstream culture. And it did help. Reading the Bible gave me exposure to a moral framework outside of liberalism and a concept of the divine that I felt was missing in the secular world. Politics depressed me at this point, so I shifted my attention toward religion, which actually provided some purpose that I felt was lacking. My interest in politics re-emerged in mid-2015, though by no choice of my own. The next year and a half would be crucial to shaping the worldview I have today, though initially I didn't want anything to do with politics. I was dragged into it. The two major events that happened in mid-2015 that had an impact on me were the start of Donald Trump's presidential campaign and the European migrant crisis of 2015. Most of my news consumption at the time came from Facebook. I followed most of the major mainstream media publications, but beginning in 2015, my Facebook feed saw an increase in political posts from my friends and family. At the time, I essentially held the beliefs espoused by PragerU, so I was not for nor against Trump in any major way. It's important to note that I'm Canadian, but the US election and the presidential campaign dominated the news at the time. What pushed me in the direction of Trump was not Trump himself, but the reaction that he invoked on the left. Starting in mid-2015, my Facebook feed became a constant stream of Orange Man bad, white Americans are horrible, multiculturalism, feminism, and LGBT are good. It was like reliving the backlash to the Trayvon Martin George Zimmerman trial, but on a daily basis now. And it began to leave the internet and dominate real-life discussions. Trump became the right-wing boogeyman for SJWs at my university to proclaim the threat of the white supremacist patriarchy. It just pissed me off. I went from disliking progressivism to just flat out hating it. I began secretly supporting Trump just in hopes of seeing the shit libs on my Facebook and university eat crow. The other thing that was going on at the time was the migrant crisis, when millions of people began flooding into Europe from the Middle East and North Africa in mid-2015. This was when the Syrian civil war was at its height, and we were told that we needed to help these people fleeing the war. Now, at the time, I thought it was a bad idea to let so many people into the West, but you have to remember, the only perspectives on the migrant crisis I was exposed to were the mainstream media and shitlib Facebook, so I didn't realize how bad of an idea it actually was. Donald Trump was the one counter voice I heard on the matter, but he was denounced by all the other media I had at my disposal. I even remember one idiot professor at my university telling us how awful Stephen Harper, Canada's former Prime Minister, was for not taking as many refugees as Germany. It would only be a few months before I realized just how much of a moron this professor was. Because late 2015 and early 2016 was a turning point for me. Prior to this, my discontent with modernity was that I simply found it vacuous and boring. But I had never before thought that the leaders of our liberal society were leading us down a dark path. This would change for me on November 13th, 2015, when Paris was struck by the Islamic State terrorist attacks, which would leave 130 people dead. Now, I had seen terrorist attacks before. I was alive during 9/11, albeit I was very young, and I remembered the War on Terror quite well. It was not the fact that the attack on Paris happened that shocked me so much. It was the reaction. For weeks following the attack, I was bombarded with pro-Islamic propaganda. My Facebook feed was subjected to constant posts about how horrible Europeans were for their Islamophobia and how peaceful Muslims are. The entire MSM was on the defensive, trying to crush any discussion of the cause of the attack. I even remember all our politicians in Canada visiting mosques to show solidarity with Muslims, as if they were the real victims. The entire time, I was perplexed at the lengths the establishment was going to go to avoid the reality of the attack. Now, the event that really hammered home for me just how much danger the reigning liberal egalitarian ideology in the West has put us in happened less than 2 months later. It was the Cologne sexual assault attacks on New Year's Eve 2015 in Germany. We were only a month and a half removed from the Paris attack that left 130 people dead when on New Year's Eve 2015, 1,200 German women were sexually assaulted in multiple cities across Germany, most notably in Cologne by 2,000 men of migrant descent. I know that the Rotherham scandal in the UK took place before this, but since I'm from Canada, I had never heard of it because it wasn't reported on here. But the Cologne attacks made international news. And it was not only the fact that the Cologne attacks happened that was shocking, but how Germany seemed to have allowed it to happen. First of all, it was perpetrated by a group of foreign men who shouldn't have even been in Germany to begin with. And when it's a coordinated attack by 2,000 members of a small minority group, you can't just simply say they're individuals. It says a lot about that group. And when it's a terrorist attack, you can write it off as extremists trying to advance a radical political agenda. But with these attacks, there wasn't an ideological or religious motive. It was one group violating the integrity of another, inside Germany's borders, the land that supposedly belongs to the Germans. Secondly, where were the German men? How could they allow this to happen to so many German women? Surely in any sane society, the men would step in and prevent such a thing from ever occurring. And most of all, what shocked me was the response from the media and the government. There was an anti-racism demonstration outside of Cologne Cathedral only days after the attack. So rather than the migrants who committed these crimes, the actual villains were Germans who dared to point out the obvious connection between migration and the sexual assaults. There was even reports, though I haven't been able to verify them, of the German government and police trying to downplay the attacks or avoid pointing out the obvious cause. It just seemed like every aspect of liberal society had allowed the attack to happen. And absolutely nothing of substance was done. Sexual assaults by migrants in Germany have continued unabated since Cologne. And the vast majority of the perpetrators of Cologne to this day have not been arrested. For me, this put a major dent into the entire liberal egalitarian worldview that I had been raised to believe was the only moral way to run a society. Because Cologne was reflective not only of Germany, but of liberalism as a whole. The entire ideology pushed by the institutions of the West, what's taught in the public education system, the narrative pushed by the media, what the politicians hold up as quote-unquote our values, all of it was proven wrong by Cologne. But often, to break yourself out of your conditioning, you need someone to tell you that the emperor has no clothes. All this had been racing through my mind, and thankfully, in early 2016, I visited my old childhood role model, the Polish war veteran. After listening to the outright delusion coming from the media, it was him who put it to me straight and said that Europe was absolutely insane for letting all these migrants in from the third world. And it really finally struck me how twisted and inhuman the egalitarian orthodoxy ruling over the West truly was. I remember that professor telling me only several months ago how Canada should have brought in more migrants like Germany. I realized then how much of a fucking idiot he was. I realized that the reigning ideology in the West was pushing us to disaster, so throughout 2016, I found myself disgruntled with the entire liberal system that surrounded me. As a university student in Toronto, I found it extremely difficult to find outlets of alternative viewpoints, seeing as the media, the universities, the government, and many of my peers seemed fully invested in progressivism. The only counter voice out there was Trump. In 2016, looking for alternatives, I came across the anti-SJW content that was popular back then. I joined a few Facebook groups and started watching YouTubers like Sargon of Akkad, Kraut & T, yes, I actually used to watch his videos, and other skeptics. I also returned to watching boomer content like Steven Crowder, Dennis Prager, and Paul Joseph Watson. And this provided me some comfort. It was finally an outlet that was pushing back against the progressive dogma which I had grown to despise so much. A true moment of satisfaction for me was when Trump finally won the presidential election in 2016. And seeing the shitlibs in the media, at my university, and on my Facebook page choke on their own smugness. So by the end of 2016, I would say I was an alt-light civnat. However, I still felt uncomfortable with my political position and the content that I consumed. Though the alt-light or skeptic commentators I listened to would bash SJWs and Islam, it was still within the liberal paradigm. It criticized progressivism, but deferred to the very liberal system that had created my discontent with modernity way back in 2012, before I even understood any of these problems. So while I knew what I hated, I was still not able to step outside of the Overton window completely and fully remove the influence of liberal egalitarianism from my worldview. It's not that I didn't realize there was problems with the alt-right, classic liberalism, and civic nationalism. I just hadn't been exposed to a school of thought outside of the liberal paradigm. And I think that's a problem a lot of people on the right face. They hate the current ideological consensus, but they haven't been given anything else as an alternative. So from skeptic and civnat content, I eventually found reactionary and dissident right-wing arguments. First, it started on forums and Facebook groups where these new ideas started to come in, Then I began to watch channels like Black Pigeon Speaks and The Iconoclast, which were a step up from what I'd been consuming at that point. I now began to return to the more radical content I had briefly encountered back in 2014. I started exploring anti-democratic and anti-egalitarian arguments. A few channels that became my favorites were Millennial Woes, Distributist, Braving Ruin, and Fritz Imperial. And what was so appealing to me about reactionary thought was not only was it a critique of progressivism, but of liberalism as a whole, including the classic liberalism of the anti-SJW crowd. I fully broke away from any liberal positions when the skeptics were routed by the alt-right in the Kraut & T race realism drama of late 2017. This is what allowed me to remove the mental barriers of egalitarianism that had been implanted in my mind through the public education system. This is what allowed me to fully understand what it was that made me so discontent with modernity all the way back in my mid-teenage years. This is when I began to understand that the reason I found historical eras so fascinating but the present day so depressing had a lot to do with culture, community, morality, and identity. That these are the things that gave life purpose, and I had to accept that culture and identity are strongly linked to ethnicity, and multiculturalism destroys that. Reactionary thought also made me realize that this matters a lot more than so-called liberal values. What do democracy, free speech, or individual rights matter if you exist in a nihilistic, spiritually dead society, where your life is completely void of any meaning? Freeing my mind from the mental disease of egalitarianism also allowed me to take a more objective look at the dangers I saw facing the West. I was able to look at things like crime rate, demographics, welfare usage, and voting patterns without feeling guilty of wrongthink for drawing conclusions from them. And from here, I was able to envision the future that mass migration and anti-white social justice politics was leading us to, and that it was a lot darker than I originally had thought. That our civilization was in decline in a very real sense. Rejecting liberal values and embracing neo-reaction made me understand why hierarchy was both natural and necessary. That the Whig interpretation of history, which states that for all of its history the West was racist, sexist, and oppressive, and that liberalism is progressing us towards more freedom and equality, is completely false. If liberal egalitarianism has created this dysfunctional society we live in, maybe there's a reason things like monarchy, aristocracy, ethnocentrism, gender roles, and religion existed in the past. It was to run a healthy and long-lasting society. If the foundations of the West are falling apart, what progressives consider to be progress begins to look a lot more like destruction. This was the first time I actually felt I had a political position consistent with what I wanted for the world. And I had the urge to explore these ideas further, so I started my YouTube channel in late 2017. From there, I made a greater effort to both understand what is wrong with the modern world and what can be done to fix it. So I made a greater effort to read philosophy, political theory, and so on, and of course, I still love reading and learning about history. I started by reading people like Aristotle and Machiavelli, and then I moved on to the more reactionary authors like Chesterton, Mencius Moldbug, and Nick Land. I also have now read many of the Enlightenment authors who I'm currently making a series of videos critiquing. Early on in my channel, after I began to understand the problems of things like mass immigration, Islam, multiculturalism, and such, I was of the belief that the elites were just dumb and that they didn't understand the problems they were creating. But I no longer think this is the case. After all, if I can figure this out, either 1, I'm wrong and I'm worrying about nothing, or 2, they know this is true because they're not dumb. They are the elites after all. There was 2 channels that convinced me that they do know the problem but are facilitating it for their own benefit. One of them was the now unfortunately defunct Frame Game Radio, which exposed the full extent of the anti-white policies active in the West, and the sheer amount of money power behind them. The other was Blackpilled by Devin Stack, who exposed just how long the West has been propagandized by progressive ideology, and the societal narratives that it pushes. I'm now of the belief that there is a very real and deliberate agenda to destroy the West, and that it's being facilitated by the institutions of power, and that this has been going on for several decades now. By mid-2018, once I had taken this all in, I felt blackpilled. I felt as though we had been sold out and that we lost something we could never recover. I spent several months bitter and resentful, but toward the end of the year I got over it. I came to accept that what is already lost is lost, and rather than trying to put something back together, the answer is to create something new of value for the future. That you can't undo modernity, you can only conquer it. So that's how I came to neo-reaction. And my cause is the promotion, preservation, and continuation of both my own Canadian heritage and the wider context of Christian European civilization. That the spirit of Western man that captured my fascination in my youth can be brought to life again in our modern world. I think I was bound to end up here. I always knew what I wanted, but now I can express it. I feel like reactionary thought is the full realization of conservatism once the shackles of egalitarianism have been thrown off. And I don't think my political journey is over because as I learn, I constantly change aspects of my worldview. Now, I'm fairly sure that my overall position within dissident right-wing politics will remain the same, but you can never close yourself off to new information and thought, because then you stop learning. For me, the red pill was a very tough pill to swallow, because it has made me realize that there is real evil and wickedness in the modern world. That the safe, secure, and prosperous life enjoyed by previous generations isn't going to last forever. And that the clown world that we live in today is a window into the future that has been set upon us. But at the same time, my original dissatisfaction with modernity has been vindicated. That I'm not simply unable to fit into it, that there really is something missing which has left so many lost and alienated. The biggest white pill for me was realizing that nihilistic consumption isn't all there is to life. That there is truth, goodness, and beauty in this world, and it's there for us to pursue it. I wanted to make this video so anyone can understand why I believe what I do. If you're a fan of my channel, I want you to understand that I'm not some brilliant intellectual or some great conqueror who has all the answers. And for anyone on the left, nor am I some hateful bigot or radical extremist. I'm just an ordinary person like you trying to understand the problem of modernity and hopefully contribute towards a healthier alternative. That's why I'm a reactionary. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. If you'd like to join my new Discord community, or you'd like to support the channel, you can now do so. Links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.